Somewhere beyond thought, one of them began to feel an itch, not a physical one. No nerves remained to fire, no muscles to tense, but something old and half-formed stirred, a flicker of discontent, like the ghost of instinct brushing against consciousness. It was not pain, and it was not fear. It was simply friction. As though the great silence had developed a seam, this one, whoever they had once been, became aware that something had shifted, not in the world, which remained frozen and vast and grey, not in the bodies around them, still fixed in their endless tableau, but in the rhythm of their own mind. The thoughts came differently now, faster, heavier, and momentum began to build. Something was accelerating. They tried to slow it, to fall back into the syrupy drift that had defined their existence for so long. But the current had changed. The pressure was inward now, downward. The spiral that had once held them gently was tightening, sharpening, pulling them in towards something central and unseen. And in the center of that pull, something was watching, not with eyes, not with intention, but with a kind of passive gravity, and noticing that demanded nothing yet refused to look away. The awareness was not sharp, it was round, soft, eternal, like a lake without a bottom. And still the untethers dimmed. One of them began to whisper, though they had no mouth. The whisper echoed anyway, not as sound, but as memory. It fluttered like a torn scrap of paper, brushing the edges of other minds. Most ignored it. One followed. That one, the second, felt their thoughts change shape. Ideas once fluid began to calcify. Words returned, not whole, but in fragments. If, dark, go before. They formed no sentences. They offered no meaning, but their very presence caused something else to react. Something beneath the floating. The earth had long since become a canvas of cracks, but now the cracks began to widen. Not physically, not in any way that could be seen, but conceptually, as if the idea of below was no longer content with silence, as if depth itself had grown curious. And what lies beneath silence is always hunger. The presence beneath, if it could even be called that, had no features, no body, no will. It did not hunt, it did not move, it waited. And as it waited, it was fed, not by action, but by attention. Every flicker of awareness that turned downward, every drifting thought that paused a little too long in its fall, was absorbed. The untethers, once content to drift in inward spirals, now found themselves pulled, not just deeper, but closer, not spatially. Space had no true meaning anymore, but in terms of focus. Their thoughts, once hazy and shapeless, began to take on edge and contour. They remembered forms, faces, not clearly, but distinctly. A cheekbone, a broken watch. The smell of hair in autumn wind. These details bloomed suddenly in the void, bright as flares, and just as brief, and when they vanished, something else was there to catch them. The second one to stir, the one who had followed the whisper, began to gather. They didn't know what or why, only that they were collecting pieces of something inside themselves. Shapes, words, weights. They were heavy things, the kind that changed your posture, even in a place with no gravity. Soon the others felt it too. The gravity, that subtle tilt downward, that pull. What had once been effortless floating was now effortful resistance, as if the stillness itself were becoming denser, syrup thickening around them, asking them to let go, not fall, just stop holding. And some did. One by one, they began to sink. It wasn't visible. You couldn't see them move, but you could feel it, their presence descending, dropping into a deeper layer of silence, one that wasn't empty, but full of memory, full of noise that had been compacted so tightly it felt solid. The ones who remained began to feel colder, not in the way flesh feels cold, but in the way stone feels after the sun has gone, a cold that has no temperature, only absence, the warmth of shared memory, the hum of presence between them. It began to fade, and then came the knocking, not real, not sound, but unmistakable, like the memory of someone pounding on a door you were never supposed to open. It reverberated through the residue of who they were, echoing off the inside of forgotten skulls. It came in pulses, slow, methodical, patient. Some tried to run. They didn't move. Some tried to scream. The silence held. One tried to answer. They reached downward, not with limbs but with memory. They offered an image, a sunlit staircase, dust in the air, the sound of someone coming home. They pushed it downward like a flare, and the knocking paused, not stopped, paused, as if interested, and then came the whisper again. The first one, fainter now, further, but not gone. It was saying something now, not words, but meaning. Come closer. The whisper slid into their thoughts, like a needle beneath skin, not sharp, not painful, but unmistakable. It didn't speak with a voice. It didn't need to. It used their memories as its mouth. For one, the whisper came in the cadence of a father's bedtime hum. For another, it was the rustle of trees outside a childhood window. For another still, it was the soft click of heels in an empty hallway. Each heard something different. Each was drawn the same. The second untethered, the one who had begun to gather now pulsed with a strange weight. They had no heart, yet something beat inside them, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a signal from the bottom of a deep-sea trench. Their thoughts were no longer their own, though they didn't know it. Their sense of self was stretching, changing. It no longer said, "I'm alone." It now whispered, "I am many." They began to absorb the residue of others, not violently, not hungrily, just by proximity, just by stillness. As those around them dimmed and sank, traces of them clung like vapor, regrets, fragments, broken impressions. All of it drifted toward the one who remained most focused. And in this concentration of thought, something else bloomed, an idea, unshaped at first, then sharper. Dissent. They had never considered it before. Not truly. They floated, they existed, they remained. But this idea was different. It offered motion, not freedom, but purpose, a downwardness, a destination. And once the idea arrived, it would not leave. Others felt it too. Not all, not many, just a few, those who had resisted longest. They began to turn their awareness downward, as if drawn by scent or gravity, or hope. But there was no hope here. Only the shifting density of a thought too old to belong to a person. They called it below, though that word was far too small. The knocking returned, louder now though still soundless. Not a demand, a promise that something was beneath the floating, that something had always been there, that they had been watched, counted, and now called. The second untethered, or what had once been the second, began to change shape, not physically, but conceptually. Their sense of presence grew teeth, not to bite, but to hold. They became an anchor, a beacon, a hole in the surface of silence, through which something else could crawl upward. And something did. It came not as shadow, but as familiarity, the sensation of recognition, the smell of places they had never been, the knowledge of a face they had never seen. It came as longing, and longing was enough. The others began to follow. Slowly, like silt pulled toward a drain, they tipped toward descent. Their thoughts shifted direction, not freely, compulsively, involuntarily. They remembered doors again, hallways, ladders, shafts, holes, gravity, tunnels. They remembered falling, and the relief of it, because falling meant motion, and motion meant end. Even terror became a kind of permission. They floated still, but it no longer felt passive. It felt like teetering on the edge of something that wanted them, and they began to want it back. The whisper was no longer alone. Now it echoed, and beneath it, a sound even older. Breathing. The breathing was not a sound. Not in any way sound had meaning. It was a pressure, rising and falling, an expansion of absence followed by a contraction of certainty. It resonated in the hollow space where fear once lived. It wasn't alive, but it lived, and it had waited long enough. Those who descended first did not notice the change. Not completely. They felt lighter, though they were sinking. as if something was lifting the weight of choice from them. Their thoughts narrowed, funnel-shaped, moving always toward the same point, though they couldn't say what that point was, only that it called, that it welcomed. The ones who still floated above watched in the dimming, and while they couldn't move, they felt the distance open between themselves and the ones below. The air, if it could be called air, grew thinner, tighter. Thought itself became harder to shape, like language was being stolen syllable by syllable. They weren't being stripped of knowledge, they were being stripped of the means to remember it, and yet one among them fought the pull. They had no name, none of them did, but this one remembered a shape, a pattern, a rhythm from a world that had had halls and heat and breath, and they held on to that shape with all the strength their formless mind could muster. A square of sunlight on floorboards, the glint of dust in the light, a single thread of a girl's laughter. They clutched it like a talisman against the dark, and the dark noticed. The pressure changed. It turned toward them, not physically but completely. As if all the cold intelligence beneath the silence had tilted its focus toward a single thread of resistance. The breathing paused. That pause spread. Time, if it still existed, stretched like a membrane being pulled taut. The silence grew aware, and in that awareness something blinked, not with eyes but with realization. It had missed one. One had remembered. It reached for the memory, and the untethered pushed back. They didn't know how. It was not an act of strength, but of refusal. They simply did not let go, not of the moment, not of the thread. They focused on the dust in that square of light, and refused to let it dissolve, and in doing so they burned, not in fire, not in pain, but in light, a glow, soft, barely visible, but enough. The others saw it, or felt it, a pulse of something not quite hope, but contradiction, a shape where there should have been none, an act where only surrender had existed. For a moment, a single suspended eternity, the pull weakened, and the whisper cracked. Only a little, but enough. The breathing drew back, surprised. Not threatened, it was far too old for that, but unsettled. It had not known anything could resist, not here, not in this place. It had mistaken the untethers for empty vessels, thought them hollowed out by stillness. But this one had carried a spark, and now that spark was drifting outward, slowly, delicately, burning holes in the fabric of eternity. The spark spread, not quickly. It was not a fire. It was quieter than that, softer, but it moved. From one untethered to the next it passed like a breath held too long, and finally exhaled, a memory of warmth, a flicker of shape inside formlessness. Some received it without knowing. They felt something pass through them, not hope, not resistance, but clarity, the kind that hurts more than it heals. For the first time they didn't know how long, they knew something. They had been seen, not just by each other, not just by the presence beneath, but by themselves. One recalled a lie they told. Another remembered a face they had forgotten they'd loved. A third felt the ache of a door they never opened. And suddenly, what had been silence became regret, not just remnants of memory, but a realization. They had once lived, fully, messily. They had been real, they had mattered, and the presence below felt it. It recoiled, not in fear, but in friction. The clarity resisted. It was not compatible with its hunger. It could not feed on a soul that remembered itself. So it struck, not with violence, but with weight. It pressed down, not to destroy, but to crush the light, back into forgetfulness. It wrapped itself in silence again, thickened the stillness, suffocated thought where it bloomed. The spark dimmed. One by one, the untethers who had been touched began to flicker. The clarity didn't vanish, it turned inward. They didn't fall, but they sank, as though diving on purpose now, no longer drawn by whisper or gravity, but choosing to go where the dark had once called them. They went not to be taken, but to confront. The second, the one who had begun to change earliest, had become still again, not asleep, not defeated, simply full. Their presence had stabilized into something cold and vast. They were no longer one. There were many, but the first, the one who remembered the sunlight, began to glow again, brighter, bolder, and then they vanished, not sank, not moved, just ceased, and with them, the spark vanished too. The others, those who remained, felt the light go out, and in that instant, something closed, a door perhaps, or a thought, or a choice. The pressure beneath stopped breathing. For the first time in eternity there was nothing, no motion, no pull, just waiting. It wasn't over. It had never truly begun, but now, it was listening again, recalculating. There was no victory. There was no escape, only the awareness that some small resistance had once flickered, and that whatever had been watching from below had felt it, had remembered it, and that made it hungry in a new way, not just to consume, but to understand. The untethers, now dim again, returned to stillness, but it was a different stillness, tense, expectant, as if waiting for another spark, another deviation, another name, because now the dark knew there were fractures in its silence, and it would not be surprised again.